Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 586. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about cenotes and sharks, cave tubing and coral reefs, Mayan ruins, and Mennonites as we go to Belize.
I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We've got two sponsors of this show who we'll hear from in a bit, but first, let's talk about Belize. I'd like to welcome to the show Allison Greene from EternalArrival.com, who has come to talk to us about Belize. Allison, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, we're talking about Belize. I should mention, some of you who've been listening for a very, very, very long time may remember that we did an episode about Belize, which I quite enjoyed, actually, but it was episode 33. So that puts it probably in early 2006. So it seems like it might be time to do one again. Allison, what's your connection to Belize?
I visited Belize twice. I visited once as a solo trip that I bought impromptu for my birthday about 4 years ago. And that was a short trip. I was only there for about 4 days. And I was there more recently. I was there in February of this year. I was traveling partly with a friend, partly solo through the country. And I spent about 2 or 2.5 weeks in Belize.
Excellent. And then we're going to have you pick out your best week-long itinerary for that. But why should someone go to Belize, first of all?
Well, Belize is actually a very unique country within Central America. Most of Central America, obviously, is Spanish-speaking and has a history that's been a lot more influenced by Spanish colonization, whereas Belize was actually one of the only countries that was colonized by the British. And as a result, you have a really interesting mix of cultures happening there. You have everything from indigenous groups that came from the Caribbean, the Garifuna and the Creole. And then you also have the Mestizo population, the Maya population. So you get a really interesting melting pot that you won't see anywhere else in Central America.
When I was a kid, I think it was still British Honduras.
It was, yeah. I think up until the 1970s, I'm horrible with exact dates, but I would say sometime around the late 60s or 1970s was when it became an independent country instead of a colony.
Excellent. And what kind of itinerary would you recommend for Belize?
There's really something for everyone, and if you want to get sort of the best spread of activities, I would say that you probably want to split your time between the beaches or the islands
Mm-hmm.
and the mainland where you have the jungle and a lot of the Mayan ruins. So I would say that about 4 days is good to explore some of Belize's beaches or islands, and there's a lot of different choices. Probably the most popular destination would be the islands of Key Cocker and San Pedro, which are about an hour from Belize City by boat. And there you have really easy access to the Belize Barrier Reef. It's actually the second largest barrier reef in the world, right after the Great Barrier Reef. And there's really, really great conditions for diving. The visibility is excellent. The reef is quite shallow, actually. So even if you're not a diver, there's a lot of snorkeling that you can do. Really beautiful marine life like spotted eagle rays, sea turtles, all sorts of fish and coral. So it's a really great place if you like to dive or snorkel. And for the brave amongst us, you can actually snorkel with sharks and manta rays. And it seems a little terrifying, but I've actually done it twice. And both times I emerged unscathed, maybe having aged myself a little bit for the experience. But it was really, really an unforgettable experience that I would really recommend to anyone.
Well, and when you mentioned going out to the islands, I know when we talked to Kimberly way back in episode 33, they were going out to islands small enough that they were paddling out there on sea kayaks and were staying on islands that basically had some huts and not a lot else. I mean, very small islands. What are you talking about here?
So I'm talking about the bigger keys.
Okay.
So that would be Ambergris Key, which has a population of about 10,000 people, and Key Cocker, which I'm not sure probably has about 3,000 or so. So these are definitely much larger islands than what we're talking about. You definitely can still access the smaller keys and smaller islands of Belize. If you take a sailboat or do some kayaking, you definitely can access these smaller keys, but these are more larger islands where people actually live, where there's an abundance of guest houses and hostels and hotels, whatever you're looking for, you can pretty much find it on these islands.
Okay, excellent. And by the way, answer the previous question, British Honduras changed to Belize in 73 and then got full independence in 81. So you were right in the money there, I think.
Great.
Excellent. And what are we going to do once we're there? You mentioned we're going to be doing some scuba or snorkeling. Did you do that independently? Did you find a dive operator there?
Yeah, so I went with a dive operator. I went with Ragamuffin Tours when I was in Key Cocker.
Okay, I love the name.
Yeah, they definitely live up to the name. It's definitely a fun atmosphere. There's lots of music and rum punch after you've done your snorkeling, of course. And it's just a really nice and fun atmosphere for a good day out. And they're a really great tour company. They do all sorts of things to maintain the quality of the reef, making sure that everyone wears biodegradable sunscreens that don't interfere with the reef. A lot of people don't know that you really should not be snorkeling or scuba diving with your average sunscreen from the drugstore. You need to use a reef-safe product. And they have some other initiatives that maintain the quality of the reef out there because, as you know, coral bleaching is a huge problem happening all over the world, especially with the sea temperatures rising. So Hol Chan, the marine reserve in Belize, Hol Chan is the name of the marine park that's right outside of Ambergris Key and Key Cocker, and the quality of the reef there is probably one of the best that I've seen, even better than the Great Barrier Reef, which I went to in 2000 and 2012.
Well, and the Great Barrier Reef is really under a lot of stress right now with some starfish that no one knows quite where they came from, as I understand, that are eating the reef. So,
oh, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, lots of issues there and other reefs in the world as well these days.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And Belize is doing, I think, a better job than most of protecting the reefs there.
Okay. When we're not in the water doing snorkeling or scuba, what else are we doing in Belize?
So that's where you probably want to go inland to see more of what the country has to offer in terms of jungle and biodiversity, and also in terms of the Mayan temples. So similar to the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala, Belize has a lot of Mayan temples in the area. One of the biggest cities of the former Mayan Empire was called Caracol, which you can access from the town of San Ignacio, which is about 2 hours to get to Caracol from San Ignacio. But that's the biggest Mayan site in all of Belize, and it's really quite spectacular. Some people compare it to Tikal, and I think it's definitely quite smaller than Tikal, but you also won't have any of the crowds that you'll have in Tikal. So Tikal is in Guatemala, and it's probably the biggest Mayan ruin in the world, as far as I know. And Caracol is smaller, but equally impressive, and that's in Belize, about 2 hours away from San Ignacio.
Well, and I should apologize to our listeners because we didn't put Belize on a map, but you're mentioning, for instance, the Yucatan Peninsula, so we're just not all that far south of Cancun on the same coast. We're south of the Riviera Maya, and before the coast takes a turn to the east and turns into Honduras, there's Belize, a little gap of Guatemala and Honduras, and Belize is not a big country. When you talk about going inland, you're not going all that far.
No, I think if you start in Belize City and then you go to San Ignacio, which is pretty much right on the border with Guatemala, you're talking about 2 hours driving distance.
Okay, and you've just driven the entire width of the country.
Exactly, yeah.
Excellent. Let's take a break here and hear from the first sponsor of this episode. This week's episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Fragrance X. Fragrance X is America's largest fragrance outlet. They offer free shipping and up to 80% off brand name perfumes, which is a way better deal than you're going to get in the duty-free shop. And then you also don't have to go on the plane smelling like perfume. They also help you find discontinued perfumes, and I've had that problem at Christmas and Valentine's Day. For my wife, it was trying to track down a specific Halston fragrance, and for my mother, I can't even remember what it was that I went all over town looking for. So Fragrance X, you can also get 20% off using the code TRAVELER20 at fragrancex.com. Thanks again to Fragrance X for sponsoring this episode. So you mentioned going to San Ignacio and we're going to see the ruins. How did you arrange that? Did you see it on a tour? Did you go independently?
I was traveling solo in San Ignacio, so I was mostly going with a variety of different tours. So it's pretty easy to find tours once you get to San Ignacio. You just walk up and down the main pedestrian street and you have plenty of people who are willing to help you find the right tour for what you're looking to do.
I suspect they may even come up to you and ask if you want to do a tour.
Exactly. It's quite easy. And there's all sorts of things you can do. There's lots of caves as well. And I don't know why I didn't say this first, because this is actually my favorite thing to do in all of Belize. But there is an amazing cave in the inland of Belize called the ATM Cave, which is short for, and I'm going to probably butcher the pronunciation, the Octun Tunachil Muknal Cave, which now you can see why they've abbreviated it to ATM. It's an incredible cave complex where there are the remains of, I think, 14 human sacrifices during the Mayan era. And you can go caving about a kilometer into the cave. So you have to get into the water and through all these cracks and crevices with only a headlamp on. And after about 45 minutes of wading through the cave and swimming and going through these cracks and crevices, you have to climb a rock that's about 15 feet. It's not too hard to climb, though. You climb a rock, and then you get into this giant atrium. So there are a lot of clay pots and human sacrifice remains that show that this was an intentional place of burial for people during this era.
And when you say during this era, I'm assuming this is during the later Mayan period, because as I recall, in the earlier Mayan period, there weren't human sacrifices.
They have found artifacts from as early as 700 AD, but they're thinking that many of the sacrifices came in near the end of the Mayan civilization, and that they're starting to think that a drought is what ended the Mayan civilization. And they think that these burials might have been a response to trying to make the gods less angry with them and save their civilization.
Interesting. Well, I know one of the issues that we learned when we were just further north of there in Uxmal, as I recall, up in Mexico, is that they would sacrifice to the god Chuck, the rain god, when there wasn't enough rain, and they would sacrifice by towards the later end of the Mayan period. And we think they got this idea from some of their neighbors, is why we think it's later in the period. They would sacrifice people and throw them in the cenotes, which they believe was connected to gods. Unfortunately, it was also connected to their water supply. So, so it turned out to be a very bad practice. And so occasionally you would just abandon your city because clearly God didn't like this city because everybody's getting sick. But
Wow.
don't throw dead bodies in your water supply.
Good rule of thumb.
Yeah, good rule of thumb. So I think there's a lesson in there for all of us. Excellent.
Yes.
And what else are we doing while we're in the San Ignacio area?
There are plenty of other caves where you can go cave tubing, or you can also go horseback riding throughout the region. There's a really beautiful area close to San Ignacio called the Pine Ridge Nature Reserve, and that's a really beautiful place for hiking and horseback riding, all that sort of thing. You can find waterfalls. There are a set of pools called the Rio On pools that are a series of waterfalls and natural pools that are really beautiful and easily combined on a tour with Caracol, the Mayan site that I was speaking of before. And there are all sorts of other activities like bird watching. Belize is really well known for its birds, and I'm not a bird watcher personally, but I've heard that it's one of the best places in the world for bird watching and that sort of thing.
Now, you kind of skipped right over cave tubing, and not everyone has done that. So there are probably a few people scratching their heads about what you're talking about. Describe for us what you're talking about here when you say cave tubing. This is known by different names. So, for instance, when I was in New Zealand, they called it blackwater rafting.
Okay, well, cave tubing is pretty much just going down a river in a inflatable tube, and it's obviously a little more rugged than your average pool toy inflatable. But it's basically just an inflatable tube, and you sit in the tube and you just float down the river and let the river take you wherever it wants to take you.
Except that you're in a cave.
Yes, of course. But not the whole time. You come in and out of the caves, yeah.
Okay. And this is because so much of the area is caves and sinkholes and things like that these all connect. So you're going in and out of caves, but still on the river that is heading its way lazily to the ocean.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, when I did that in New Zealand, it was quite cold and we were in wetsuits to do this. What's going on here in Belize?
The climate is definitely a lot more tropical in Belize.
Sure.
And so the water is cold, but it's so hot out that you really don't mind the cold, and you can just wear your average swimsuit. You definitely would not want a wetsuit. You'd be baking like a potato in a wetsuit. So you pretty much just go down in whatever you would wear.
Okay. T-shirt and a swimsuit or something like that.
Exactly.
Maybe some water shoes or something like that. Do I have a light on my head as well, since I'm going in and out of cave?
You would.
Okay. Excellent. And is there an operator that you used while you were there, or just somebody you found in San Ignacio?
I went with Maya Walk Tours. They're probably the most reputable place in San Ignacio, and I went with them when I went to the ATM cave, and then I just kept going with them because they have the best reputation, good prices. So Maya Walk was my go-to company while I was in San Ignacio.
Got it. So you did the cave tubing with them, and then which other activities did you do with them as well?
I went with them to Caracol, and I also went for the ATM cave.
Okay, so they don't just do adventure trips, but they also do some interpretive trips as well.
Exactly, all sorts of cultural trips and day trips from San Ignacio. So it's not only adrenaline activities, it's also your more run-of-the-mill ruin tours and that sort of thing as well.
Okay. And let's take a break and hear from our second and final sponsor. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by Time Slippers. There's one company that is set out to make relaxing as easy as possible. It's Time Slippers. They have reinvented traditional house slippers with the sole purpose of making your feet more comfortable than ever, even on the go. They boast a modern design so you can wear them out of the house and no one will even know you're wearing slippers. They have yoga mat insoles and a plush wool lining to keep your feet cozy and warm. They slip on and off so you can fly through airport security lines with ease. It's a really great gift for the holidays. Use the code Amateur Traveler for 20% off your first pair. You can only get them at timeslippers.com. That's www.timeslippers.com. And thanks to Time Slippers for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. What else should we do while we're in Belize?
I would definitely be remiss if I didn't mention the food. The food in Belize is really, really good. It's a real mix. You definitely have a lot of the same food from the Yucatan Peninsula. So you'll have cochinita pibil and a couple other dishes that you'll find in the Yucatan as well.
Which is a stuffed pepper, if I'm remembering correctly?
It's pork that's rubbed with achiote and then roasted.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had the wrong dish.
It's really, really delicious. And there's also, they're like tostadas, but believe they're called salbutes. And they're corn tortillas with like a beans and cheese and all sorts of treats on top. It's very similar to some of the things you'll find in Mexico, but with a little bit of a twist. And there are also a lot of influences from the Caribbean and Jamaica. So jerk chicken is very common there, and it's one of my favorite things to eat in Belize. And curry chicken is also quite popular. Another thing that's quite popular to eat on the coast would be conch. So those big giant shells that you see in Lord of the Flies. That's one of the most common seafoods that they eat in Belize. And it's really delicious as ceviche. Actually, it's a little bit chewy, but really good. I quite liked it. So they use that in ceviche, and they'll also make it into a fritter and fry it. And those are some really typical Belizean dishes that you can try while you're there.
Okay. And do you have particular restaurants you would recommend?
It's so hard for me to remember the names of the restaurants.
These are not places you looked up on Yelp or TripAdvisor, but just saw while you're walking down the street. Okay.
Yeah, the way I usually travel is just walk around and see what looks or smells good. And so most of the places I went were hole-in-the-wall places as I was walking around. So I don't have any specific restaurant recommendations.
Well, where were you walking around? Where would you recommend we walk around to find good food?
So in San Pedro, there are a couple main streets, and there are basically three main streets.
And you said San Pedro, and I'm not sure where San Pedro is.
So San Pedro is one of the islands.
Okay.
That's Ambergris Key.
Got it. Okay.
The main road that is where dock will be, you can walk up and down that main road. And the street parallel to it, those are probably the two best streets for food. And you can get everything from jerk chicken to Salvadorian pupusas, which are
small or round corn tortillas with meat, usually.
Exactly, yeah. They're small corn patties with meat, cheese, beans, whatever you want, and then topped with a cabbage slaw and some tomato sauce.
Okay.
And there's a large Salvadorian population living in Belize because I think of what's been going on with El Salvador, with a lot of violence happening there. People have moved over to Belize. And there's a lot of Salvadorian people making really delicious food there. On Key Caulker has about 3 streets. So pretty much anywhere you walk, you're going to find food. And again, it's really popular to have the jerk chicken there. Sometimes it's not even on like an actual restaurant. It'll just be someone with one of those big steel drums with the pimento wood smoking, and you can just get really delicious jerk chicken right on the beach, right on the streets, and served with some rice and beans and plantain. And in San Ignacio, where I would recommend you eat, I'm remembering the name of one restaurant now called Ko Ox Ham Na, which means let's go eat or something.
Okay.
And that is one of the more popular restaurants in Belize. That's one of the places that I actually looked up on Yelp and found when I was searching. And they have really traditional food as well as more Western options if you're not feeling adventurous. And so there's a lot of really good food in San Ignacio, though, as well, if you just walk up and down that main pedestrian street as well.
Now, one place that I noticed we're not talking about is Belize City.
Yes, and that's for a reason.
Well, I had to ask.
Yeah. So Belize City has a bit of a poor reputation, and having transited through there twice, I can definitely say that it's not really a place that I would recommend most people visit. There's a lot of crime in Belize City. And there's definitely, that's where you see some of the social problems that Belize has with respect to homelessness and some mostly nonviolent crime. But Belize City is the place where you're probably going to have the highest chance of encountering crime. And there's not really too much to see there. There are a couple museums, but for the most part, I just use Belize City as a place to transit from. So going to and from the ferry terminals or from the ferry terminals to the bus. If that's all you're doing, there's really, or if you're coming in from the airport, there's really no reason to be afraid of Belize City because the bus stop and the bus station is fine and the port area will be totally fine. But when I was in the taxi coming from the bus station to my guest house because I had to stay overnight because I had come too late to catch the ferry to one of the islands, I asked to get let off for an ATM. And my friend and I were sort of followed by a couple people who did not give us the best vibes. So we quickly got our money, got back into the cab and went on our way. But I wouldn't really recommend staying in Belize City. And I haven't ever heard anyone recommending it. It just...
I hadn't either. That's one of the reasons I wanted to ask the question, because we really hadn't talked about it, but you had talked about going through there, and I figured that was related. So
yeah, it's fine to go through, but it's not a place that I would spend much time. I was there for one night and lived to tell the tale, of course, but and it just doesn't have enough to recommend it. There are no great sites to see, as far as I know, in Belize City. There are some places outside of Belize City. There's a Mayan site, Altun Ha, that's pretty close to Belize City. And there's the Belize Zoo, which is not very close to Belize City, but it's closer to Belize City than other places. Other than that, though, I mean, all the sites that you can see, you can pretty much see from San Ignacio or from one of the islands or from the beaches further south. So I wouldn't say that you have to stay in Belize City.
Okay. Anything else you want to mention as far as itineraries of things to do and see in Belize?
So there are also beaches further south if you're looking to extend your stay. And I personally haven't visited these beaches further south, but I've heard good things about the beaches of Placencia and Hopkins. And those are the two that I think are mentioned most. Okay. Placencia and Hopkins are two of the more popular beaches in the south. And if you were looking to go on to Honduras after, that would probably be a good way to see a little more of the country.
Okay. The highway doesn't really go all the way to Honduras from that area. You'd actually have to cut back again through San Ignacio, it looks like.
I think you could take a boat, but I'm not certain.
That could be. That could well be.
Yeah, I haven't been to that area, but I did look into it. I ended up going into Guatemala via San Ignacio instead. But I was considering going from the south, from Hopkins or Placencia to Honduras and the Bay Islands. And I believe you can do that by boat, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. Well, that would make sense. I wouldn't be too surprised from what I'm looking at there. What surprised you the first time you went to Belize? This is not your only trip to Central America or the only place you've been in Central America.
No. What actually surprised me the first time I went to Belize was that they didn't speak Spanish. I actually was like, oh, that's a great opportunity. I'm going to practice my Spanish. And that's sort of how I justified the trip to myself. And then I realized when I was doing some research that they actually don't, well, there are people who speak Spanish there, but that's definitely not the main language. That did surprise me about Belize because it's this little English-speaking island in the sea of Spanish-speaking Central America. So that was, I think, the thing that surprised me initially. And then as I continued to get to know more of Belize, I just was sort of surprised by what a melting pot it is. You have all the different ethnic groups. You have the Creole, the Spanish, the Mayan indigenous people, but then you also have lots of immigrant groups coming in. You have a very large Chinese expat group. So you can actually get really good Chinese food in Belize, which is surprising.
Okay, that would be surprising, all right.
And then you also have a lot of expats from Canada and the United States as well. And then you also have, oddly, a group of Mennonites who have come from Canada and the US and Russia, who have now set up base and produce a lot of the fruits and vegetables in Belize, which I found really interesting. So it's a very multicultural and diverse little section of the world. And I just found that really interesting and really surprising as I got to know more of Belize.
What do people recommend, the guidebooks or the tourism board, that you do in Belize that you didn't think was really worth the time?
For me personally, I don't think you need to see all of the Mayan sites. I think that Caracol is probably the most interesting of them all. There are a couple others near San Ignacio, like Chunantinich. I can never say it properly, but there are a couple smaller Mayan ruins in the vicinity of the San Ignacio area. And I think that those can be skipped. I would say to pick one of the ruins in the San Ignacio area and visit that, and definitely to visit the ATM cave.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about Mayan ruins, I think a lot of people have been to Chichen Itza, which is both spectacular and an outdoor shopping mall.
Yeah.
Quite touristy, gets busloads of tourists. When we're here in Belize and we're 2 hours away from Belize City and such, I'm picturing something that's a little less touristy.
It's incredibly not touristy, and I was very surprised by how few people I saw when I was at Caracol. I went with a tour, but I think that there were probably 15 to 25 people seeing the ruins at the same time as we were there. It's a bit hard to get to from San Ignacio. It's still, even with a tour, it's about an hour and a half in each direction, or maybe 2 hours. So I think that does a lot to keeping it less busy. It's definitely worth seeing, because how often can you see a Mayan ruin with only 15 or 20 other people with you? I thought that was one of the most exciting parts. It's like you actually sort of felt like you were discovering something really beautiful. And you also can climb one of the main ruins, one of the largest structures there. You can actually climb to the top and get a really beautiful view. And it's so close to the border with Guatemala that you can actually see into Guatemala from the top, which is pretty cool as well.
Well, then it sounds like you combined this trip, in fact, with a trip to Guatemala.
I started in Mexico, and I traveled down from the south of the Yucatan Peninsula, from Bacalar in Mexico, and then I went to Belize City and then to the islands from there. And then afterwards, I continued from San Ignacio on to Guatemala. So from there, it's quite easy to get to Flores. And from Flores, then you can also see Tikal, which is one of the other really well-known Mayan sites.
Right. Well, and we're not going to recommend that if you just have a week to try and take in all that necessarily, but if you have a longer trip, certainly someplace to potentially extend.
Definitely.
Okay, before we get to our last 3 questions, anything else people need to know before they go to Belize?
Nothing I can think of specifically.
Okay. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Belize.
Oh, the chicken buses.
Okay.
The chicken bus is a very popular form of transportation in all of Central America. I experienced it also in Guatemala and Nicaragua. And basically, it's an American school bus that has been brought down to Central America and completely tricked out.
After it was used for years and years.
Exactly. Yeah. After it's been used and abused by American school children, it gets brought back down to Central America, and the people will trick it out, paint it all sorts of crazy colors, add neon lights, lots of religious memorabilia, lots of Mercedes decals and that sort of thing. And it's just a really fun experience to sit on these chicken buses. And I mean, they stop constantly, so it's not a fast way of getting anywhere, but they'll stop pretty much every mile, pick someone up, drop someone off. And there's no air conditioning, loud music, but it's just a really, really fun way of seeing how locals live and get around. It's just a very nice cultural experience when you're in Belize.
Excellent. You're standing at the prettiest spot you saw in Belize. Where are you standing? What are you looking at?
That would be Key Cocker, looking out at the ocean. The water in Key Cocker, I mean, you could think you were in the Maldives. You could think you were in French Polynesia by the way it looks sometimes. On a clear day, the water in Key Cocker is just absolutely stunning.
Excellent. And finally, if you had to summarize Belize with just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Beautiful.
Okay.
Chaotic.
Okay.
And unforgettable.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Allison Greene. Allison, where can people read about your travels?
I blog at eternalarival.com, and you can also find me on social media at Eternal Arrival.
Excellent. And if we wanted to point people at your best article about Belize, what's the article we're going to point them to?
I have an article that sort of sums up all the different things you can do in Belize called 21 Unmissable Things to Do in Belize. And you can find that just by navigating from my homepage.
Or in a link in the show notes. We'll take you there directly. Allison, thanks so much for sharing with us your love for Belize.
Thank you for having me.
In news of the community, I'm recording this episode in London, and I need to apologize because I was asked whether I was doing a listener meetup, and it just never even occurred to me. I'll be back in London. I'm doing some work for Time Out here in London, so maybe we'll do that next time I'm in town. Apologies to Michael, who caught me out on that in the Amateur Traveler Facebook page, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. I'm always looking for people to write for the blog as well. Remember, the Amateur Traveler is more than just a podcast. It's also a blog. Some of you blog regularly about your travels on Amateur Traveler, and I quite enjoy hearing about your travels as well. If you're interested in that and want to know more details, just drop me an email, host@amateurtraveler.com. We've got a number of different episodes already in the can, ready to go for this year. We have shows coming up on Quebec and on Belize and on New Caledonia. So if you don't want to miss any of those shows, make sure you subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening your podcasts through. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, join that Facebook page or join the private Facebook group at amateurtraveler.com/trips, where we're talking about where we're going next. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe.